So to begin, I always like to begin with all the speakers to introduce themselves and kind of what are you doing right now in DevSecOps and government to give us a little context. Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim Ford. I am an Azure specialist with Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft about 3 years, so I've only been practicing capitalism for a short period of time. Before then, I was actually protecting it as a Navy Intel officer for 20 years. What I'm doing right now in terms of DevSecOps is paying a penance for being a bad government customer to tech companies for most of my career, trying to get people to accelerate their migration into the cloud. And when I talk about the cloud, I talk about it across the entire arc, all the way from hyperscale down to tactical edge, and have several current projects, particularly with Navy and Marine Corps, that are looking at DevSecOps and the adoption of those principles for rapid response to emergent requirements for software capability.
Great.
Cool. Hi, my name is Jimmy Pham. I'm a principal architect from Booz. DevSecOps has been, I guess, part of my life for a while now. I've been driving it mostly from the enterprise perspective, and what I've seen is, when you look at adoption of DevOps or DevSecOps at the program level or individual application, it's a little bit more straightforward. And in working with a lot of the big agencies within civil DoD, what I've run into is mostly on the cultural side, which is just driving me nuts, right? But at the same time, it's a slightly different paradigm in order to have full adoption of the enterprise, which led to one of the things that I convinced our leadership at Booz is to open source the framework that we put together to address the governance, to address the multi-tenant and the pipeline as code in order to have that adoption across multiple programs. So that's kind of where I'm focusing a lot on, is at the enterprise level, how do we make this happen at scale?
Patrick?
Hi, I'm Patrick Curran. I'm the federal CTO for a company called Planet Technologies. What Planet does is we implement DevSecOps across multiple federal agencies, as well as state and local governments and the commercial sector as well.
Jimmy, is your mic working?
I think so. Nope.
Can you?
Nope. Hello?
If not, we have backup.
It's okay.
Yep, great. So I'm going off script a little bit, just to FYI. I think earlier today we were talking about DevSecOps and the challenge is, it's easy to go greenfield and go right into implementing a lot of the concepts we're talking about today. But the reality is government is much of it is O&M. So as agencies are looking to migrate existing applications to the cloud or modernizing perhaps an application that they already did a lift and shift of in cloud, how is that, what are the challenges or opportunities that you see in getting teams to adopt this DevSecOps approach to legacy apps?
So I'll take that one. From the lift and shift from the on-prem into Azure, I don't think the federal agencies are having too much of a hard time with that one. But when we start talking about the CI/CD pipeline and DevSecOps for how to start deploying these solutions, it's training. It's getting the buy-in to have them understand, how it benefits them in the long run. But they come around to it, and it hasn't been too bad of a problem.
Okay, great.
Just quickly to jump onto that. I think one of the big things I've seen is understanding what the scope is. Like the majority of the time I see when they do even lift and shift, they lump everything together, different type of applications, mainframe, legacy web app, COTS and everything, and they try to produce a solution to do DevSecOps and or migration wholesale, right? And that pretty much stalls everything. So I think the expectation would be, if you look at a portfolio of applications, there's probably a good percentage that fit that mold for lift and shift, and you could do that in a very containerized way. I haven't seen an application that I can containerize, right? Especially in that type of environment that fits that mold. And from there, you could do DevSecOps pretty cleanly, even though it's still a monolith within one giant container. You still get the efficiencies from a lot of the ops side, as well as the scanning and everything else. So that's a huge first step. And I think that's kind of where both the challenge and the opportunity is because if you can go small first with a certain percentage, that just validates it versus trying to come up with a huge process that maps everything out is what I've been seeing.
Any thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, but not necessarily from my hat, my Microsoft hat.
Sure,
but,
go ahead.
When a lot of what I saw in when I was still in the service goes to the question that was asked earlier with regards to security and accreditation and getting people into the mindset of what to do. There was a large effort to educate, like Harshal talked about, to educate the security folks. I think that's one of the key impediments to progress with regards to implementing DevSecOps in the government. One of the things that you talked about with regards to scope, right? Where does DevSecOps fit in the color of money? Is it RDT&E? Is it O&M? Is it procurement, right? Where does it fit there? Contracting, one of the things that I had to deal with a lot when I was in uniform was going into a program review and trying to tell people that I had no idea what 3 spirals ahead was going to look like from a program execution perspective and still try and get money. So we maybe had to fudge things a bit and talk in very general terms about what we're going to do in spirals, but then actually execute DevSecOps under the covers so that later on we could go back and talk about all the great things that we had accomplished, because at that point in time at the next review they had probably forgotten what I had said anyway. So getting the contracting, the acquisition, the execution, and then the accreditation all lined up to be something that is that works together, I think is probably one of the biggest impediments that we have right now to implementing it.
That's interesting because as we were talking, I was thinking about the cultural change, and we are talking about often teams that have been separate and really fundamentally changing the way we work. So what are other tips as far as you go in an organization if they're not already working in, sometimes we say, an Agile approach, but really it's the faster waterfall, but maybe.
Right.
But how do you make that like real systemic change? And what's your advice here?
Yeah, so let me try to take that. I was told at one of the bigger agencies that Agile is not required to do DevSecOps, and I pretty much fell in my chair, right? I think there's a couple things without having to jump to the end result of getting the speed to deliver and the quality and everything else. The change has to happen at the fundamental level, right? And we call these like good habits. If you don't have good development habits or process, we talked about CI as a foundational thing. I mean, if you don't even have that, if you throw a pipeline in there, you're basically allowing the team to deploy things like bad things faster out there, right? Because they're going to lower the threshold of unit testing coverage, they're going to lower the threshold of security, and they're going to accept that. So I think it is about getting a strong assessment across your team, right? And seeing fundamentally, are there things there that needs to be infused first, right? Let's say unit test, make that a good thing, reward it, recognize it. And then, from an Agile perspective, recognize it, reward it, understand that's a prerequisite. And I think it happens there because I've seen a lot of times where those are kind of brushed aside and say, throw in a pipeline and then just go, right? And then they go back and...
So how do you train a team? Do you go for like the easy apps that perhaps if you, how do you start in your portfolio?
Yeah, it's hard when you look at the enterprise level because you have a variety of teams. You got teams that are doing really critical O&M work on some of the critical systems that you probably cannot disrupt just yet. And then you got some that are lower risk that they've been running in this model for a long time. And that's kind of where you want to amplify, right? And rotate certain people in and out of those programs, right, to get that cross-training. But it is difficult because that means you're putting a lot of focus on the teams that are doing kind of the modern applications, but you got a huge group of people that are sustaining your critical mission systems that are not benefiting from this. So I personally don't know how to bridge that gap yet, other than having them force a rotation between the teams to actually have that cross-training happen. And you certainly need champions. Without the champions that keep on reinforcing those good habits, it's not going to happen, right?
So we've been talking about DevOps for a while. I guess it's all relative. And now we're talking about DevSecOps. Can we talk a little bit about that change in our conversation? I think Andrew talked about it earlier about shifting to the left. It all makes sense. But how's that really being executed in government today? Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Is it just conversation at this point, or
No.
are you really?
No,
It's actually happening.
It's happening.
Good.
but
in
it's
pockets.
happening on well, so I know it's definitely happening on the infrastructure side, right? So if we take the infrastructure as code and we take the app dev stuff and separate the two of them out, from the infrastructure as code, it's definitely making its way more prevalent through the government. I know at some of the federal agencies that we work with, we're getting more onto the software as well. So it's definitely in there. It's making progress, but it seems to be more prevalent on the infrastructure as code, at least the places I'm at right now.
Is this helping the ATO process at all? Just curious.
It is, because if you think about having to go from, you might have be in an unclassified network, and you might have to push the same code from an unclassed to a classified network, pushing things through, writing them and pushing them through a container, for example, is definitely going to help the ATO process, because you're going to have it all checked and balanced at the unclassed level, and because you're doing the exact same thing in one, pushing into the next, it helps with the ATO process.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think who mentioned it, right? Like, where are you going to have this run? The inheritance at the common platform. I've seen it work at GSA, nonetheless, where we're able to push a new application that was able to obtain the ATO in 1 month. So a lot of the inheritance that you get on the platform, including kind of the unified logging, some of the base components and everything, the patching, pretty much covers a decent amount of controls. So once you have that, it's all about the application and some of the changes in the stack that you put in there. And I do think on the software side, it's much easier and cleaner. Like, you have static code analysis, check, right? You do some of the dependency scans, check. And then you also do the runtime vulnerability, right? SQL injection, remote file inclusion, all that stuff. Where it's actually not as clean right now, people talk about continuous compliance. I'm not sure there's a full solution out there yet, because you cannot suffice all the controls, right, in order to get that ATO. A certain portion of that is still going to be manual. Mm-hmm. But there are things out there, I think Azure is doing some pretty awesome things as well, where it's going to generate a lot of the reports for you and a lot of the controls. And then depending on the compliance, like if you have to be PCI DSS for payment credit card processing, and all of a sudden, let's say TLS, whatever the latest TLS it's required, gets compromised, right? And you got to go to a new version. You can detect that, right? And that would actually flag that as part of a control on the compliance side. But I don't think it's fully automated yet, and I don't think we can get there without having some human review, right, at a certain point. But I feel like it's come a long way. I mean, if you look at Air Force and Level Up and what they're doing, that's a lot of stuff there.
We are investing a lot in automation. I think that's a big topic right now. As we look at DevSecOps, how do the hyperscale CSPs automate a lot of those compliance regulations right into the platform, and using things like Azure Security Center, being able to monitor that and bake those security compliance regulations right into the policy, so you have those guardrails up front, again, pushing to the left. Thoughts on that? I mean, we're all working towards this goal of automation and agility through DevSecOps. Kind of what are you seeing as far as advancements or, challenges in the market right now?
I think some of the challenges that we're seeing in the market come back to the lack of consistent trust with all of the stakeholders that are involved with deploying a capability in support of a government customer. The government customer wants it fast. They want it secure. They do not want to be the program manager that's mentioned in the Washington Post when there's a data breach. But at the same time, there's risk involved. There's risk not just for the government, for their constituents and the data and such around that, but also to the implementers, the system integrators, the solution providers. I think that we need to have trust amongst them as well, so that if they are building on top of source code that has been committed via another entity or another company, that there's language in those contracting vehicles that allow for that risk to be diminished and a level of trust amongst those players to be inherited. One of the things that we are seeing right now is sometimes a little bit too fractured of an environment when you look at different programs of record, because most of these programs of record or systems of record are all done by separate organizations, by separate companies. There's questions about intellectual property, there's questions about trust there, the risk management across those different organizations. I think that those barriers still need to be addressed. They're not talked about. They're not talked about enough. But I think that they're a persistent threat to a true intersourcing across a government organization, a true adoption of DevSecOps at a wide scale.
Thoughts on kind of where we're going this year,
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the point of, I think there needs to be more of a focus on not all applications are the same. So, deploying something on an F-35 is clearly different than some of the other applications, and it could go against a different type of process. And I feel like if more of that adaptation happens in terms of categorization of those, we would get much faster adoption. And then clearly on things that are at the critical systems like a F-35 or any of those type of applications, it's definitely a different process where you will probably most likely will not do automation all the way to the end to production, right? You're going to sit at one point where you're going to deploy into a simulated environment or a staging, and in the case of weapon systems, you're probably going to sit at a integrated lab to run everything before someone gives the go-ahead, right? So it's a different type of process, and I think the recognition to not have one size and one process fits all is a really good step to help accelerate, right? Yeah. The other piece is the hype around machine learning. Everyone talks about it. It is happening. I think, Harshil just mentioned it too, from an ML perspective. The ability to actually be open for cross agencies to understand how they detected certain things and how they solved it, and applying that back into the scans, right? Like the pattern recognition is probably the most powerful thing that can happen from a community in order to see how different signatures, if you will, can be patched or get addressed, and that would accelerate a whole bunch of things too.
What's that adoption look like today?
I mean, I don't want to ride the hype curve right on ML, but I think all the components are there, all the compute power is ready to be applied, right? It's a matter of just people coming up with solutions and applying in the right way that actually is beneficial versus being a science project. And you see a lot of that application right now, and it's going to be a big part of all the stuff here.
So who are we seeing as early adopters in government?
You mean like agency-wise? Or?
Agencies.
I think GSA is pretty forward-leaning. The Air Force is, I'm sure you guys heard a lot about the Air Force. DIUX, Kessel Run, and Level Up, and all that good stuff. I think it's caught on. USCIS has been one of the front runners, right? With the stuff that they're doing with AWS and OpenShift. Those are ones that come to my mind. I'm pretty sure I'm missing some, so I apologize.
Patrick, thoughts?
Well, I've always I love what SBA has done with closing their data centers and moving everything into Azure and going with or trying to get into infrastructure as code as much as possible. Like their whole DevOps practice over there. So that's a great example of who's really jumped in with both feet.
Great. Well, I definitely want to give some time for the audience to ask questions. We already had a lot of engagement to begin with, and we've got to take her. Vishwas is ready to go for the first question for the panel. He's right here.
I saw you. You were at the door. If you have others, we can go first. All right, so a quick question. I think there was a slide earlier which talked about container as a service, functions as a service. And, if you look at those models previously, they were in a sort of shared compute models, not very conducive to sort of, ATOs and things like that. But now that all of the PaaS services can be, things like private link and things like that, you can have your own segregated environments. Is there a move that you think from this could be a question for Microsoft, maybe Jim? If you take a look at function as a service, which can be completely isolated, can we do a lot more in terms of just designating that as ATO ready? Because all the aspects of it are controlled by the cloud provider, including the isolation.
Right.
That would go a long way in sort of come in and drop the code, do the scans, and you are 95% there.
Yes.
Some moves there around making FAS or functions as a service ATO ready.
So what you're speaking of, every evening I pray to the accreditation gods that someone adopts that approach. We are not seeing yet that level of understanding and trust from the organizations that are ultimately responsible for defending and managing the risk. I think that if you take a look at where the current level of expertise is at, it has grown over the past 2 decades to embrace just where we are right now. And it has taken a lot of time and effort and training. Where we are is we can't expect that to be turned over in just a short period of time, whatever that period of time may be. When I look at how long or what it took when I first entered into the service to where I was, where we were when I left, it was completely different. There was no such thing as HBSS and ACAS and all of those things. The fact that there's actually a cloud security requirements guide, posted is really a monumental type of effort that's underway. I think that the speed of cloud has driven the speed of government to respond, but we can't expect for that to be changed overnight. Do I wish that we were moving faster as a government community of interest to address these and maybe take some chances with commercial tools that are out there, commercial practices that are out there, methods and methodologies for implementing what we want to get to? I think that there's room for that, and I think we are seeing pockets in certain areas. But again, I would say that it's still
early days,
fractious, right? In terms of the widespread adoption of that. But again,
it's
I
early
wish
days.
a unicorn came through with a fairy on it sprinkling magic dust, right, in order to make it happen, but we're not there yet. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
We're getting off easy.
Oh, sure. Yes.
So you mentioned, Mr. Pham, the notion of Agile teams and doing DevSecOps without Agile teams. I think we've all seen some really badly implemented Agile teams. What I like calling the sort of Agile teams in name only, Atinos.
Agile forward.
Yeah, faux Agile. So I find that government in places can be very resistant to like some of the pure notions of Agile. and how you square, teams that are self-forming and fluid with contractual obligations. It can sometimes be very, very challenging. I'm interested in your thoughts on just how we make this all come together inside of the sort of limited contractual schemas that we all have to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to, I had a bunch of talks that covered the acquisition side of the house, right? So I'm not sure if this is a trend in the agencies that you guys work in as well, but you've seen a lot of the RFPs come out that are asking for just teams. Outcomes and teams, right, is kind of where we're talking to our clients and trying to educate that. That's probably where the best bang for buck is, right? Even from a customer standpoint, that you want outcomes, right, and you want teams to develop something, right, versus having the traditional model of, there's an IV&V team, there's an O&M team, each one has a performance metric that they go against, and that's why they're so focused on that, right? And that kind of sets the barrier together. So we've seen that shift a lot. I mean, the ask is coming for agile teams, fully autonomous teams, right, from the vendors, tech challenges to show how you do agile as a whole, right, and then do the implementation. So I think that's continuing and possibly having a good momentum as well. As far as actual implementation, we do a lot of work with agile coaching. And, at first I look at it and I'm like, is that going to be effective? But I've actually seen it work, right? Having strong coaches embedded in teams and making sure that they actually follow or at least adapt to what is needed, right? Versus running agile and thinking that you're agile, right? I think that's been critical in some of the areas that I've seen success, is that you do embed an agile coach, not just to follow the ceremonies, but they're in there, they understand the process, and they actually promote the grassroots change, right? I think that's been one of the best things I've seen, right, that worked.
Question in the back? I mean, as we get to that question, what are the best resources for people looking for more training? Do you have any go-tos?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of coaching, but I
just
think,
like self-learning.
Yeah, I mean, everyone goes to Udemy now, right, and do a lot of that training as well. But I do think it's well worth the resource to actually get coaches in there, like the actual coaches that's done software development, not just certifications, to help kind of drive that. I guess that passion, that understanding, and making people kind of stick to it, right? Because it's very easy to just steer away when the deadlines come across, and then you all of a sudden, yeah, we don't need to do testing, right? So the coaches actually keep them honest.
Karina, I think you just stole my question.
Oh, okay, there you go.
It's okay, great question. I just want to follow up on that. Recently, I think we've just had certification for DevOps, for Microsoft DevOps, but right now, I don't see any DevSecOps type certification. So could you expound on how the government's approaching the OPM or any type of job classifications, and how someone can hire someone with the correct certifications and basically live up to the job classifications? Thanks.
Yeah, so just a quick comment on that. I think you have the specialized certifications, right? On AWS, you have a specialized competency in DevOps, and in Azure as well as in GCP. Security is implied in there. The certifications we took, there's a huge security component to it. But I think the notion of continuous compliance and some of the newer things that are putting in there, there is no real certification that encompasses it all. So if you come across one, I would probably question it. But I think there's probably opportunities for some institution or agency to kind of jump on that. But you have to have some sort of credentials to actually make that something that people would be valid, right? Because what I'm seeing is there is very specialized certifications, but it's against specific CSPs or tooling, right? And I don't think there's going to be a generic one, if you will, like Agile, because that's a methodology and a process. There's a lot of tooling involved with DevSecOps.
And that took a foundation to set up.
Yeah, there's like a foundational thing. Right. So, yeah, foundational things I would say is learn containers and some other things as well. But.
Okay, sure. Hi, my name is Steve. I'm from Microfocus. This just came across my email last week. Safe no longer for DoD. Are you familiar with that? The DoD CSO signed a memorandum of record that they should not use SAFe, which is a scaled agile framework, and it's highly discouraged for any DevSecOps. Are you familiar with that, and can you elaborate?
I am not familiar with the reasons why they did that, so I would not want to comment on the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, same here, but there's different camps, right? I mean, I'm sure if I take a poll here, there's camps that says, yes, scaled agile, right? And there's some like, no, it doesn't work. I mean, I think it's a matter of opinion there. I don't want to kind of speak on behalf of them. I've seen it work for certain things. I'm not a big fan, but that's just my personal opinion, not Booz Allen.
So
I know it's a non-answer, but
there's another. I came across a Northern Virginia DevSecOps group that meets. You guys have any experience with that? And is that a good thing to participate in if you want to learn more?
That's probably Peter Burkholder's group, and we've had them come and
It's
speak.
Downey, Chris Downey.
Well,
It's a different
are you familiar with Peter Burkholder's group? It's a DevSecOps or
not
DevOps
sure.
group.
But on the side note, before I forget, right? Are people familiar with Kessel Run and
Yes.
the Air Force stuff? I forgot the guy's name, Brian something. But he started his own company, and we have conversation with him about. I forgot his name, Brian something. But I just had a conversation last week. Anyway, he approached us because we've done a lot of the DevSecOps executive training and coaching and stuff like that. But we're looking at putting together a master class, right, for the government, and it's mostly for educational purposes, so that we can drive that change from top down. So that might be of interest when it comes together.
I think one of the things with regards to getting certified or these sort of the more dogmatic approaches to DevSecOps, I don't think that there's enough yet there that people have coalesced around in order to actually have those types of certifications that you see with PMP or Agile or what have you, right? There was a lot of definitions of what Agile was before the Agile Foundation, came together and decided what those things actually looked like from a less stochastic model with regards to Agile, right? I think that DevSecOps is still in its it's definitely past its embryonic stage, but I don't think that there's been enough coalescence around what those are in order to actually get to the point where there's a set of certifications that everyone has agreed on.
What's interesting is, part of my role at Booz Allen is to develop the learning pathway for DevSecOps engineers, right? And if you look at the curriculum, it's a mix of all the major tools and concepts across what we call the different pillars of DevSecOps, right? Continuous integration, continuous monitoring, configuration management, infrastructure code, et cetera, et cetera. Within each one, we highlighted kind of the top things that we've seen our government is using, right, and our clients are using. For example, within infrastructure as code, we have people scale up on Ansible, Terraform, Chef, right? So it's hard to say that there's one certification, and I'm saying, if you have a focus or affinity on infrastructure, we can provide, I can talk to you and provide like a set of things that I would say is probably good to know and get certified in, and that would be a huge foundation, right, for anything. But that's an excellent point.
Hey, so Jim, you mentioned earlier, you touched on the challenges that kind of play against implementing DevSecOps into the government market. You mentioned that it was the stakeholders. Where is that reluctancy coming from, or where is that stemming from the stakeholders?
So I think it depends on each stakeholder, right? And not necessarily, a lot of times it comes down to individuals versus organizations and their roles. But I think that in the implementation of DevSecOps, you have inherent friction for the deployment of capability, right? You have developers that are being told to move fast, right? They have the tools there. You have mission owners that want capability deployed. They want it done cheaply. You have security that if they haven't been brought in at the beginning of it, which of course that's what this is all about. There's inherent friction, and I think that friction can definitely be broken down through good policy, good training. I like, like you were talking about the rotation of people through. But one of the things, so when we first started implementing DevSecOps with the program of record that I ran, we hired security professionals and placed them in the accreditation shop, right, as plants, basically, right? They made sure that everything was being done according to the security guidelines that we needed to have put into place, so that when stuff got to the point that the accreditation shop would go, done, our men in Havana were already there making sure that all of the skids were greased, right? That's maybe a little underhanded way of getting it done, right? But it ended up working. What they ended up doing was actually infecting the rest of the shop, the security shop, to those principles, so that they were much more comfortable with it when other groups started doing it as well. That's just one way, right? And by the way, I'm not as a Microsoft employee, I'm not saying hire accreditors and place them surreptitiously in security offices, right? But it was one of the ways that we were able to sort of spread that knowledge. I hope I answered.
Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
So
I already dodged one question.
we'll take one more and then we'll start wrapping up.
I don't even like that.
We need it for that.
Thank you. So earlier we talked about ATOs and expediting the approval process through containerization. Are there anything else out there aside from training and getting more education out there? Have you seen more of a move towards infrastructure as code for groups that aren't fully ready for that, full containerized environments, or what are your expectations of how to kind of baby step up to that point?
So are you talking about on-prem or like you're in the cloud? You're talking about on-prem? Yeah, so one experience I had was that you would be able to generate a decent amount of the actual documentation, but you won't go all the way through, right? Like, one question I get all the time is, hey, do you need containers to do DevSecOps? Do you need containers to? Technically, no, right? But if you want to go through that hassle, then you don't, right? But there's a lot of efficiencies and benefits that you gain if you're going to make a investment to do DevSecOps. Might as well go, right, and jump that and make that leap. But I've seen situations where it's on-prem, they're not ready to go containers. It's still fine. You can still do it, right? You can still automate the process where you're building the artifacts, you put it in the repo, and you scan it and everything else, right? It's just not a container as clean as it is. The biggest thing is on the security accreditation, the ATO side, is they expect a certain number of documentations and process. The biggest thing, back to that question, is policy. So, for example, most people have a policy in there that says developers won't have access to the credentials to actually deploy into something, separation of duty. And then we say, well, it's not a developer, now it's a machine. Like, well, that doesn't happen. That can't happen as well. I'm like, well, I can't automate. So the policy has to change, right? So I think getting to be really good friends with the security folks and understanding what they expect and saying, hey, I'm going to make your lives a lot easier, right? You want this document? I get you this document. It's just going to be automated, right? And you're going to see it this way.
And reduce their risk.
Reduce their risks, reduce their work, and still give them the sense that they are in control is probably the biggest thing. People do not release ops team, they're in control. And when you say automation, that's like to them releasing control. But you have to present it in such a way where it's automated, you're still in control, it's just going to do it for you. You have ultimate control at the end of the day if you want to shut it down, right? You get to press the button if you want to.
So as we wrap up this conversation, what's one piece of advice you'd like to tell everyone wrapping up? Patrick?
Be patient. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
It takes time to get this all up and running correctly.
Jimmy?
It's pretty short. It's pretty good. I think understanding what you want out of DevSecOps. Everyone looks at it and say, "Hey, DevSecOps, it's speed, it's quality, it's security, it's all this stuff." But your number one challenge may not be all of those, right? So just taking the pieces. For example, if you go to a lot of talks, you hear Amazon say they deploy 11 seconds, every 11 seconds they deploy, but Disney never says that. Like engineers from Disney always say they have zero change defect on the infrastructure. So they're very proud of that because that's the area that they want to focus. That doesn't mean they can't deploy 11 seconds, right, every time. So just understand what is it you want out of it and map it out so that you have a very targeted roadmap.
Start small. Start small, build from there. Start small, get that perfect, then move on, and expand out that balloon of capabilities.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for volunteering your time. It was a great conversation.